Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926, in southeastern Cuba. His father, Ángel Castro, was a Spanish immigrant who became a successful sugarcane farmer. He owned land where he grew crops. Ángel Castro first married another woman, but later married Lina Ruz González, Fidel's mother. Together, they had 7 children. Among them was Raúl Castro, Fidel's close political ally. Fidel grew up in a wealthy family but saw the struggles of poor workers. This shaped his views on inequality. As a child, he attended Catholic schools, where he showed great intelligence and drive. His early education included attending a Catholic boarding school. Later, he studied at the Belén School in Havana. There, he excelled as a student and performed well in different school subjects. Fidel was also an outstanding athlete. He participated in several sports, including baseball, basketball, and track. His love for sports taught him discipline and perseverance from a young age. During his school years, he gained a reputation for being determined and hardworking. Teachers and classmates recognized his leadership skills, which became clear in both academic and athletic activities. In 1945, Fidel Castro began studying law at the University of Havana. The university was full of political tension, and many students were part of violent groups. Castro got involved in politics and joined student protests. He was inspired by ideas of social justice and wanted to change society. This was his first step into activism. In 1947, he joined an attempt to overthrow the dictator of the Dominican Republic. Although it failed, it showed his growing interest in revolutionary actions. The next year, in 1948, Castro went to Colombia for a student event. While there, riots broke out after the killing of a popular leader, Jorge Eliezer Gaitán. The riots became violent, and Castro took part in the unrest. He saw how people could rise against the government when they were angry and needed change. After returning to Cuba, he became a strong critic of the Cuban government. He started speaking out against corruption and the unfair treatment of the poor. By the early 1950s, Castro was fully involved in politics. He joined the Cuban People's Party, which wanted reforms to improve the lives of ordinary Cubans. He became a candidate for political office in 1952. However, the elections were canceled when General Batista took power in a military coup that year. Batista's takeover ended democratic rule. Castro saw this as a betrayal of the Cuban people. He then decided legal action was not enough and turned to revolution. In 1952, Batista took control of Cuba through a military coup, canceling elections and establishing a dictatorship. This left many Cubans unhappy, including Castro. Seeing no way to fight Batista legally, Castro decided to form a rebel group. He gathered supporters who wanted democracy and began planning their first attack. On July 26, 1953, Castro led about 160 rebels in an attack on the Moncada military barracks. They hoped to start a revolution, but the plan failed badly. Most of the rebels were either killed or arrested. Castro himself was caught and put on trial, where he defended himself with a long speech about justice. In court, Castro argued that the Cuban people needed freedom and better leadership. Despite this, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the attack. Though imprisoned, Castro's ideas spread. His speech, "History will absolve me," was shared widely, making him even more popular among those who hated Batista. Castro stayed in prison for only 2 years before Batista released him in a political amnesty. This decision aimed to improve Batista's image, but helped Castro instead. After being freed in 1955, Castro traveled to Mexico. There, he continued to plan his fight against Batista, gaining more followers and preparing for the next step. In Mexico, Castro and his brother Raúl formed the 26th of July movement. This group was dedicated to removing Batista's government and changing Cuba's future. After being released from prison, Fidel Castro went to Mexico. There, he met other revolutionaries, including Che Guevara. they trained for their return to Cuba. In 1956, Castro and 81 others sailed back to Cuba on the yacht Granma. The landing was disastrous, and most of them were killed or captured by Batista's forces. Castro and a small group escaped to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They started guerrilla warfare, using surprise attacks against government troops to weaken them. The rebels gained support from the local population. They used the mountains as a base, attacking forces loyal to Batista and spreading their message of revolution. Castro's fighters received weapons and supplies. More people joined their cause, believing in their fight against the dictator, Batista's corrupt government. By 1958, the rebels controlled large parts of the countryside. Batista's forces were struggling, facing both military defeats and growing public anger. One key battle was the attack on Santa Clara in late 1958. Led by Che Guevara, the rebels captured a train full of government soldiers and weapons. The rebels' victory in Santa Clara was a turning point. Batista realized he was losing control, and his troops were no longer motivated to fight. As rebels continued their attacks, Batista saw no way to stay in power. Facing pressure from all sides, he decided to leave Cuba in January 1959. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, marking the victory of Fidel Castro's revolution. His group of guerrilla fighters had overthrown a ruler who had controlled the country for years. Castro entered Havana a week later, welcomed by crowds. He became the most powerful leader in Cuba. The country had high hopes for his promises of justice and reform. Castro quickly introduced land reforms to help farmers. He also improved education and health care. These changes gained him support from many Cubans who wanted a better life. The new government aimed to reduce corruption and create equal opportunities. Businesses were controlled by the state, and many employers had to follow new labor rules. At first, many people supported Castro's leadership. His speeches inspired hope and confidence. He promised democracy, freedom, and a brighter future for all Cubans. However, some business owners and political leaders worried about his growing power. They feared their rights and properties might be taken as the government expanded its control. By mid-1959, Castro had removed political enemies and taken stronger control. Manuel Urrutia, the first leader after Batista, was forced to leave, which showed Castro's authority. Many believed his leadership would bring positive changes. He worked to improve life for poor people, but his enemies worried he would not allow different opinions. Castro's speeches emphasized unity and national pride. He also started forming friendships with other nations, which would later shape Cuba's future in global politics. After taking power, Castro introduced several radical policies. He nationalized private businesses and industries, taking control from owners. Land reforms changed Cuba's agriculture. Large estates were divided and given to farmers. Many landowners lost their properties because of the policy. The United States was unhappy with these changes. In response, it reduced trade with Cuba. Relations between the two countries quickly became worse. In 1961, the U.S. supported Cuban exiles in attacking Cuba. This event, called the Bay of Pigs invasion, failed. Castro's forces quickly defeated them. The failed invasion made Castro stronger. Many Cubans now supported him more. He also increased ties with the Soviet Union after the attack. Cuba and the Soviet Union became close allies. The Soviets provided military and economic help. This deepened tensions between Cuba and the U.S. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. This caused great fear in the United States. The U.S. saw the missiles as a threat. They demanded their removal. For 13 days, the world feared a nuclear war could start. The crisis ended when the Soviets removed the missiles. In return, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. It also removed its missiles from Turkey. Fidel Castro established a one-party system to control Cuba's society. The Communist Party became the only legal party, and it controlled politics, media, and economy. Opposition was not allowed, and those who disagreed faced imprisonment or exile. The government limited free speech and controlled all important decisions in the country. Despite restrictions, Castro expanded social services. Education and healthcare were free for all, but the economy became weak, relying on Soviet support for survival. Cuba faced economic struggles due to poor management and U.S. sanctions. Industries were inefficient, and production was low. People depended on government support for daily needs. The Soviet Union helped Cuba by buying its sugar and providing financial aid. This support kept the economy stable, but made Cuba heavily dependent on Soviet trade. Castro centralized economic decision-making, but his plans failed to improve production. Without Soviet assistance, Cuba would have faced even greater shortages and poverty. Cuba played an active role in foreign conflicts, often supporting communist groups. Castro sent troops to Angola and Ethiopia, helping allies in wars against rival forces. Although some believed Cuba acted for the Soviet Union, Castro insisted the decisions were independent. He wanted Cuba to influence global politics beyond Latin America. By supporting other nations, Castro improved Cuba's international reputation among communist countries. However, these actions also cost Cuba valuable resources and soldiers' lives. After the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Cuba faced serious problems. The country lost economic support, and shortages of food and goods became common. People struggled daily. Fidel Castro allowed some free market changes to help the economy, but political control remained strict. Despite difficulties, he refused to abandon communism in Cuba. In 2006, due to health problems, Fidel Castro passed power to his brother, Raúl. This was the first time since the revolution that someone else took leadership of Cuba. Raúl Castro officially became president in 2008 after Fidel stepped down. Raúl took steps to open Cuba's economy while keeping the Communist Party in control of the country. He allowed more private businesses and foreign investment. These changes helped the economy slightly, but many Cubans still faced hardships in their daily lives. Fidel Castro stayed out of politics, but sometimes gave advice. In 2016, he wrote a letter criticizing U.S. policies and reminding Cubans about their country's independence. Fidel Castro died in 2016 at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era in Cuba. Many people remembered him as a strong leader, while others criticized his rule. His policies had shaped Cuba for decades, leaving a lasting impact. Some saw him as a hero who fought for independence, while others argued he limited freedoms. Cuba continued under Raúl Castro's leadership, still following communist policies. Fidel's legacy remained debated, with some praising his efforts and others questioning them.